and the collection of data. Hello?
Sorry, go ahead. It's just our archive that began. Go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No
kind of threw
problem.
me off a little bit.
No.
I just wanted to acknowledge that my graduate student, Mala Turner, has played a pivotal role in the collection of the data that I'm going to share with you today. And as you mentioned, this project has been supported by the National Center for Preparedness and Catastrophic Event Response. So today, during the seminar, you're going to be introduced to the topic. We're going to talk about, basically answer the question, why study first responder behaviors. I will also go over some of the key or core themes that will be used in the discussion. Then we'll move into a discussion of the analytic approach that we've taken to address some of the essential research questions that we pose surrounding first responder behaviors. And then I'll move into the findings, and then it's just an overall discussion of those findings. So in regards to, and next slide, in regards to first responder behaviors, or why study first responders behaviors, it's important to note that in the event of a natural or any major crisis event, first responders are relied upon for mitigation, response, and recovery efforts. In a nutshell, they were relied upon to provide assistance in the reestablishment of order out of chaos. Because they are so heavily relied upon in the midst of a crisis, I believe it's imperative that we seek to better understand first responder behaviors. Failure to do so can result in inadequate preparation, mitigation, and recovery efforts. Next slide, please. Currently, most of the nation's preparedness response and recovery plans for potential man-made and natural catastrophic events presuppose that first responders will respond in the event of a disaster. However, media reports of neglect of duty among police officers in New Orleans during the Hurricane Katrina crisis challenges this assumption. The divergent responses of NOPD officers to the Katrina crisis raises at least two critical questions. Next slide, please. First, what can we expect when first responders are personally impacted by a disaster? And second, is abandonment of duty a potential issue that needs to be considered by first responder agencies during high consequence events? This seminar will examine these questions. Next slide, please. The threat of future natural and man-made disasters makes it imperative to advance the understanding of key issues that first responders face and to develop meaningful strategies for preparing them for disaster response. Adequate preparation for future crisis events requires a better understanding of the critical issues that will impact the behavior of first responders who are most relied upon in the midst of a crisis. Research has shown that the efforts of law enforcement officers during a disaster often go unnoticed, but they are typically the first responders called to the scene of a crisis, and they are expected to have the most significant involvement in disaster mitigation. The degree to which law enforcement officers salvage critical actions in mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery efforts during disasters, and the degree to which other responders rely upon law enforcement's ability to maintain order, both underscore the importance of focusing on factors that may impact their response to high consequence events. So basically what I'm saying is that law enforcement officers play a vitally important role in any disaster. Because even when medical emergency personnel are needed, oftentimes the police presence is needed in order to establish order out of a particular chaotic situation. And so in most instances, law enforcement officers are relied upon in the midst of a crisis incident. Next slide, please. Society demands that the police shall function even in unexpected and dynamic situations. However, they remain human. And I think it's important to note this, that even when the police are, that basically the police are human beings, and that they are often faced with the same choices that the public are faced with in the midst of a critical incident. And so, next slide, please. So, although they are trained to respond under pressure, first responders are susceptible to the same fear-induced cognitive processes that are associated with human response to extreme stress. The degree to which individuals can effectively respond to threats is heavily influenced by the amount of fear elicited by certain stimuli. The threats arising during a disaster can cause people to fear loss of life. And when one is reminded of the potential for a loss of life for themselves and their loved ones, this can lead to what some might term to be negative decision making. However, although this is true, much of the previous literature that has examined these issues have reported that, in the main, first responders perform professionally. But we're going to kind of dissect that a little bit as we move along here. Next slide, please. So let's kind of define some of the core themes that I'm going to share with you today. So we're going to talk about role conflict, role strain, and role abandonment. Next slide, please. So let's pose the question, what is role conflict? What does it mean to say that someone has experienced role conflict? The concept of role has been used in a variety of different disciplines and modes of understanding. And role theory informs us that there are a variety of different kinds of roles that exist for individuals within society. These roles can be categorized as being formal or informal, and they can be associated with both the family, society, as well as your occupational responsibilities and identities. Furthermore, generally speaking, there exists a range of expectations, norms, values, privileges, and responsibilities associated with each of the roles that a person possesses. So basically, we all have different roles assigned to us based upon our position in the family, based upon what we do outside of our homes, as well as what we do for our jobs. So the role of law enforcement is accompanied by a host of societal and professional responsibilities that define the identity of a law enforcement officer. Traditionally speaking, the role of a law enforcement officer is defined by a set of ideals. Next slide, please. And these are just a few of the ideals that are associated with law enforcement. And so they include honor, isolation, bravery, secrecy, danger, solidarity, and I should have also listed loyalty. So these ideals tend to be considered to be vitally important to individuals who serve as police officers. So it's believed that these are essentially ingrained in the culture of most police or any policing agency, essentially. So again, you have honor, isolation, and there's a degree of isolation because often the police feel that no one else understands their plight quite like another police officer. And sometimes this is a degree of thought that the community not only doesn't understand, but that they often serve as a barrier to order. Bravery, of course, is another one. Secrecy in the sense that, again, because of the isolation, there's this sense that no one else quite understands their plight like another officer. Also, there's this sense that one has to protect all of the others. And so, therefore, there's a degree to which things have to kind of be kept between or within the group, if you will. And, of course, danger is a part of the job, never knowing if you're really going to make it home the next night. But, of course, the degree of danger depends on where one is operating. So if you're a police officer in a big city versus maybe working in a small rural town, you're going to experience a different degree of danger. And, of course, solidarity, standing firm and standing with your brothers and sisters of the force, and loyalty, maintaining loyalty among your colleagues. Next slide, please. So moving along here, just talking a little bit more about police subculture, because I think it's important for us to have a basic understanding of how the police subculture and shapes the police identity, which of course then would influence how one would see themselves as an officer operating within society, and the potential of, and how that plays into whether or not if one would experience real conflict in the midst of a crisis. So the ideal officer, according to police subculture, takes risks, is the first on the scene to aid a fellow officer, and can handle any situation in his or her own way. And in that, they tend to have this sense that honor, you're going to stand up for, you stand in the way of danger, that you're loyal to your fellow officers, and that you have a good sense of yourself as an individual, that you can handle any situation, because police officers have a great deal of discretion that they use on a day-to-day basis. And so when they're out on the street, they're making decisions, again, by themselves as individuals, unless they're teamed up. But again, it's not like they check in to make a decision most of the time. In regards to how officers tend to cope with situations or the high pressure of the job, they tend to use a great bit of humor, a lot of self-deprecation, keeping some degree of emotional distance between themselves and the stressful event. And as I mentioned loosely before, the blue wall of silence, it's a figurative term, but it's used to describe the fact that there is a barrier that officers often put up to protect one another from outsiders, and often often it results in refusing to aid superiors or other officials in investigating wrongdoers among themselves. Next slide, please. So, in kind of pulling this back into the discussion of role conflict overall, I just wanted to give you a background of some of the key pieces that I believe are associated with the identity of a law enforcement officer and the roles that they play in society. So when the expectations of the role and the needs or values of the individual occupying the role are not or incongruous, when there's a disconnect, a person-role conflict occurs. Another type of role conflict that has been distinguished in the literature is inter-role conflict, which is the incompatibility among two or more roles held by one individual. The latter is more commonly associated with the basic term of role conflict. However, role conflict has been conceptualized in a number of different ways. For the purpose of this seminar and the research that I've been working on, we've been defining role conflict as occurring when situations are so ordered that an actor is required to fulfill simultaneously two or more roles that present inconsistent, contradictory, or even mutually exclusive expectations. So, next slide, please. So here are some key definitions again you're looking at. But again, the last one on this slide is the one that we're going to be using for this discussion. And I'm going to just review it again. It's when situations are so ordered that an actor is required to fulfill simultaneously two or more roles that present inconsistent, contradictory, or even mutually exclusive expectations. And that's by Giltz and Gerber. Often these roles are rooted in one's social identity and group affiliations. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just review what I just said again because we switched slides. Often these roles are rooted in one's social identity and group affiliations. So Ethel and Turner have noted that a person's self-concept is derived from their personal identity as well as their social identity. According to social identity theory, one's sense of self reaches beyond his or her own personal identity and is often embedded within group membership. So most people have multiple group memberships and multiple group identities. If you think about yourself, you have your gender, you have your occupation, you have hobbies that you engage in, you have your race or ethnic group that you're associated with, and all of these things kind of make up your multiple group identities, if you will. So the strength of the identity's impact on the normal daily functions of life may impact the level of loyalty or priority of the identity in one's life or overall self-concept. So depending on the social context, one or more identities may emerge as being more significant than others at a particular given time. The roles that a person occupies in society are reflective of these multiple group memberships that I just mentioned. And each of these roles has its expectations of the occupant, which include beliefs, duties, obligations, rights, and privileges about what is appropriate to the performance of a particular role. So just consider these questions for a second. So I want you to think about this, and I want you to answer these questions within yourself. So if someone asks the question, who are you? How would you respond? What is the first thing you would consider about yourself when asked to describe yourself? Let's just take a moment to think about that. Next slide, please. Which did you consider first? Did you consider the role that you play in your family? Did you consider the role that you play on your job? Did you consider the role or what you do during your spare time? All of these things contribute to your identity, but depending on which one you might hold more dearly or which one you think might represent you most is probably the first thing that immediately pops into your mind. So, again, just seeking to provide further clarification of what role conflict is, I'm just going to go over some of the key findings in the literature concerning role conflict as it relates to first responders. So in regard to the first responders, Killen also suggested, that the primary group membership would trump secondary group membership during times of disaster. And he predicted that role abandonment was possible among emergency workers. However, he noted that a less common form of role conflict existed when people were faced with choosing between playing the heroic role as a rescue worker and performing basic but necessary occupational roles. This is something we'll talk a little bit about a little later on, and that's mainly what people consider to be role strain and not so much role conflict. However, he states that in terms of group loyalty, they are often impelled, on one hand, to act as a sympathetic, loyal member of society at large and to give personal aid to injured human beings. On the other hand, they are called to do their duty as it was indicated by the membership in certain occupational groups. And so therefore, you might have this situation where you have two things pulling on you at the same time. Similar to previous research, White also examined behaviors of several disaster-related organizations and uncovered only a small number of cases of role conflict, roughly 6%. And White's method found that, however, that the entire sample, 82% of the sample, reported that the first thing they did was participate in disaster relief efforts. So while 6% reported that they did experience some degree of role conflict, 82% reported that they participated fully in the disaster relief efforts. And it was ascertained that individuals enacted whichever role they felt was most germane at the moment. White further notes that the type of disaster agent may play a role in the responders' reactions, as some situations require urgent work, such as a firefighter putting out fire to ensure the safety of their community and potentially their family. Moving on along here, Rogers also conducted work examining this issue, and Rogers discovered that first responders' proximity to a significant other, both victims and those that are socially related during the impact of an event, was related to the type of emergency response possible and the nature of any associated conflicting role expectations. Other researchers, such as Dines, work lends support to the concept of role moratorium, role reduction, and role simplification, whereby only tasks relevant to the emergency situation are performed while irrelevant roles and duties are eliminated or temporarily suspended. So in the main, the review of literature indicates that while some have theorized that role conflict is possible, most have found that role conflict has not played a significant role among first responders. And we'll go back to this literature a little bit later on, but I just wanted to kind of give you a sense that there have been some studies done on this before. A number of them have reported that it's not doesn't play a major role within the first responder community. Moving on here to the next slide, please. So let's address the question, what is role strain? Well, according to the scholar William Good, role strain is the difficulty in fulfilling a role obligation. And individuals may face different types of role demands and conflicts that they may experience some degree of role strain when wishing to carry out a specific obligation. Role strain occurs when an individual finds it difficult to fulfill the multiple demands of a role, essentially. Next slide, please. So what's the difference between the two concepts that I just mentioned? Role conflict occurs when a person has to try to fulfill multiple role expectations. Role strain occurs when a person experiences difficulty in fulfilling the expectations of the role. And moving on to bring in role abandonment into this discussion. Role abandonment can occur as a response to role conflict or role strain. And so in terms of coming up with or pulling in to discussion more the dynamics associated with role abandonment, we're going to address the question, what constitutes role abandonment, or abandonment of duty, I should say. Currently, leaving place of duty without permission from superiors, leaving place of duty without permission from superiors and with no intention of returning during a critical period of time, leaving place of duty for an extended period of time without permission from superiors, and temporarily leaving place of duty for a short period of time without permission from superiors. So if you look at these working definitions, if you will, abandonment of duty can include leaving, just up and leaving and never returning. It can include leaving temporarily. It can include leaving for an extended period of time. But basically, it includes leaving without gaining permission from your superiors. And when we're talking about disasters in particular, within most first responder agencies, you have to gain permission before leaving your post in order to be in compliance with the rules and policies associated with those agencies. Next slide, please. So, and just kind of going over, again, the general consensus within the literature, a large portion of literature examines role conflict in relation to the conflict between family life and occupational responsibilities. Most of the literature argues that role conflict is not an issue among first responders. And then in general, abandonment of duty appears not to be a major issue as well. So now we're going to move to a discussion of some of the research that I've been engaging in with some of my graduate students. Just kind of laying out the analytic approach here, basically the methodology that we took. We used both the qualitative and quantitative methodological approaches. The project was carried out in 3 phases of each of the study sites, and I should mention that the study sites include New Orleans in Louisiana, Gulfport, Mississippi, as well as Santiago, Chile. We conducted background information. It includes, we also collected survey data as well as face-to-face interview data. The concepts associated with response behavior in disasters were measured. threat perception, role conflict, role strain, role abandonment, feelings of isolation, coping mechanisms, motivational factors, and perceptions of responsibility. All of these things were examined, and some others as well. And the next slide, please. So while we did all of this, the focus of this talk will be on law enforcement officers who served during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And so the data reported here will include, for New Orleans, we will review the archival data that we collected, as well as some interview data. I forgot to put that on the slide here as well. And at Gulfport, for Gulfport, we're going to report on the survey data as well as face-to-face interview data. And so we collected a wealth of information, but because of the limits of time, I just wanted to provide some key pieces I thought were the most germane to the conversation that I think is important to have in regards to this. So here's the next slide, please. So most people, if you were around at any time during 2005, August, end of August, early September, you were probably well aware of what happened with Hurricane Katrina, and most notably the situation in Louisiana and New Orleans in particular, where they had a major hurricane to come through to cause major damage, but they also had the breaches in the levee system that caused a tremendous amount of damage and chaos to the city, basically. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I know most of us have been privy to some of the information I'm going to share with you, but just to provide context for the discussion, I'm just going to go over some of the major problems that these officers face. So you had major infrastructure damage, loss of headquarters and 3 police district stations, massive vehicle damage and destruction. Here you see a car that's literally submerged underwater. Major loss of equipment. You had 80 officers were stranded and in need of assistance themselves. You had 2 officers commit suicide within the first week after the storm hit. So basically you had a good bit of chaos. And in addition to this, you had the communication systems were completely wiped out. So was electricity. And I believe they had one source that they could use to make calls that did not include cell phones. The only thing that they could use with the cell phone was texting. And that was limited, of course, because you didn't have electricity to recharge up your cell phone. And so basically the normal modes of communication were wiped out. Next slide, please. Effective communication on the loss of operation. It shifted the flow of information between upper management, mid-level management, and parole officers, and impacted the police operations. That mid-level managers had to make key decisions. It impacted the dissemination of information to the media. And NOPD officers basically resorted to using runners to transfer messages between police units. Next slide, please. In regards to the findings with this site, abandonment of duty did take place among the police officers. Media outlets reported that roughly 200 officers abandoned posts. However, according to the former Superintendent Riley, 147 officers left or abandoned posts sometime during the storm. So, in general, the department lost anywhere between 8 to 11% of its operating force of 1,750 officers at the time. So the officers who were accused of abandoning posts were categorized based on the degree of their infractions by the department. Those whose actions were considered to be most egregious were fired from the department, while others were suspended without pay for up to 4 months. Eventually, 51 employees were fired, 45 officers and 6 civilian employees for post-abandonment, before or after Katrina. So what I'm going to present today, right now to you is a review of some of the information that my graduate student and I have been able to gain through reviewing what we're calling archival information. Basically, it's reviewed case files of the officers who were either fired or who were suspended for up to 4 months. And these officers were able to basically contest their cases to the Civil Service Board. And so we were, again, able to review those case files. And among the files that we looked at, over 90% of the officers who left their posts left to attend to loved ones, and some of whom did not evacuate the city prior to the storm, while others had family members who evacuated to other cities. Next slide, please. So in answering the question of what factors influenced officers who abandoned their posts, here are some of the, these are direct quotes from the officers. So this is in their own words, the female officer. And also I want to say that we also interviewed officers. So what I'm going to present to you, some of it is from the case files, and some of it is from the personal interviews that we had with officers. And so this is a female officer who left for 5 days after the storm. She says, "I've been on the job for 7 years. I'm a very good officer, My work speaks for itself. It wasn't about me being a coward. It was not about me being scared, because I've worked in the St. Bernard, Iberville, and Lafayette housing developments for 4 years, and I'm considered one of the toughest even among the men. So it wasn't about me being scared. My main objective was to take care of my 4-year-old daughter. I was abandoned as a child, and I didn't want my daughter to feel that way, and that was my reason for leaving, my only reason for leaving." Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this one and move on to the next one. Next slide, please. So this slide, hopefully we're on the same slide together. It's entitled "Concerns About Personal Safety." This is a quote for someone. He said that, "I left the city due to the fact that everything was in chaos. I could not locate my supervisor, and I was not given any directives as to the proper course of action to take after the storm." Basically, it was every man for himself. Feelings of distress. Another person says that, "My house was completely submerged in water. I was forced to wait on the roof until rescued by NLPD. I made it to the station where everything was in complete chaos. I was distracted from the incident at my house, but they wanted me to patrol the street. I was not mentally ready to work, and I needed time to regroup, but was told that I did not have the luxury of time." So again, these are some of the reasons why people, quote-unquote, abandon posts. So now we're going to move on to some of the findings from the, next slide, please, some of the findings from Gulfport, Mississippi. And this is a picture of what some of the devastation that happened in Gulfport. And in the main of the Gulfport, the destruction that happened in Gulfport was primarily a result of the storm itself. Next slide, please. So the situation in Gulfport wasn't as heavily talked about as the situation in New Orleans. And it might have been because more people are aware of New Orleans, and it's probably also because of the drama of the event of the breaches in the levee system, of the levee system. Just seeing city streets flooded with water up to 8 feet or more water was just kind of jarring to any observers. Again, unlike New Orleans, Gulfport, Mississippi did not experience the same degree of intense media exposure. But the city did experience a massive amount of damage. And so some of the things that took place was that, of course, private and public housing was destroyed. You had businesses such as casinos and the like were destroyed. Historical historical infrastructures, buildings and the like were severely damaged. Um, the hospitals and care facilities were greatly damaged. Some of the government buildings were also destroyed, uh, including their uh, I think it's what it's called right here at the moment, but including their police headquarters. Sorry. Again, police headquarters. Next slide. Police headquarters was destroyed. Electrical power was wiped out. Cell phone towers were wiped out. Highway 90, which is a major roadway there from getting to place, was ravaged. Roadways were blocked due to storm damage. Debris from the trees and whatnot were occupying the roadways, and of course there was also a shortage of gasoline. Next slide, please. So there were no media reports of abandonment of duty among the law enforcement officers in Gulfport. And when officials were asked, because again, part of this project, we interviewed the various officials with the police department. When asked if any of their personnel abandoned posts, the general response was that this was not an issue in this department. So again, we collected both qualitative and quantitative data, but for this particular police department, for this discussion, we're going to just kind of quickly go over the quantitative data and then get a little bit more submerged into the qualitative data. So we, among the participants, majority were male, about 97%. Most were married, about 68%. 13% were single, 13% were divorced, and close to 3% were widows. In regards to the ranks of the officers, most were patrol officers at about 60.5%. We had sergeants at 26%, as well as lieutenants 10%, and administrative about 3% were administrative staff officers. Next slide, please. 84% of the respondents felt that their personal safety was at risk as a result of the predicted severity of the storm. So they were concerned about how strong this storm was going to be. 42% of the officers reported not having any evacuation plans prior to Katrina, and less than one-third of the officers reported being able to safely assist loved ones in evacuating before Katrina made landfall. We had a good bit of officers who still had loved ones still within the confines of Gulfport. 79% of the officers felt that participating in the recovery and law enforcement activities during Katrina conflicted with their family obligations. 88% of the married officers reported feeling this way, compared to 67% of those who were either single or separated. And all of the female officers, although it was a small percentage of officers, reported experiencing role conflict, compared to 82% of the male officers. Next slide, please. 70% of those who could not safely evacuate loved ones prior to the storm experienced role conflict. And 53.5% of those who suffered property damage as a result of the disaster also experienced role conflict. 37% of those who reported that the predicted severity of the storm made them concerned about the safety of their loved ones indicated that they also experienced role conflict. And 60% of those who were not able to maintain communication with their loved ones indicated that they experienced a good degree of role conflict. So now we're going to move to some of the qualitative findings. And so these are things that people said in their own words, and this data was obtained through face-to-face interviews with some of the officers. And so we posed the question, did you experience role conflict? Did you feel conflicted between your family obligations and your obligations as a law enforcement officer? So these are some of the comments back to us. Someone mentioned that Hurricane Katrina was worse than being at war. Someone stated that the guys on the force were all being tough, and part of this is not a direct quote, only a portion of this is what I'm about to say is a direct quote. The female officer mentioned that the guys on the force were all being tough, and that part of her was feeling that too. But the other part, quote, just wanted to be like a girl and curl up and cry. Another officer stated, quote, that they stole time from the Gulfport Police Department to get personal affairs in order. Another officer commented that, sick to say, but I think you're going to find most guys in law enforcement, very sick to say, again he mentioned, but most of us, because of our personalities and what we do and why we do what we do, we have a tendency to put our job before our family. Next slide, please. Someone else state. Sure, there was role conflict. I lost everything I owned, but I'm still, or even at the time, was married to the department. Someone else stated, and I quote, people realize that you have to take care of your family first and your job second. Someone else, quote, states, and I quote, no, I was fortunate enough. No, he's responding to the experience role conflict. No, I was fortunate enough to be the only one in my family down here. And me and my girlfriend, we took care of each other. So it wasn't an issue going to work. I wasn't bothered by it at all, he says. And so if you think about some of these comments, a lot of people, a number of responders said that they did not experience role conflict, but then there was a but. And sometimes that but was followed by the second quote on this slide, which is that people realize that you have to take care of your family first and your job second. Also, if you think about the quote that was mentioned on the first page of quotes for the Gulfport Police Department, an individual said that this person did indicate that they experienced role conflict, but he said that he stole time from the Gulfport Police Department and that he was able to, there was more, in dialogue, he goes on to mention that he was able to, because of the nature of the task that he was assigned, he was able to go by and check on his family. And so, next slide, please. In summary of this finding, dissimilar to previous research, this study found support for the existence of role conflict among police officers during the Katrina disaster. The inability to communicate with loved ones heightened the concern among officers. The inability to safely evacuate loved ones also seemed to heighten this level of concern among officers. However, despite feeling conflict between roles and duties, abandonment of duty does not appear to be a major problem among the officers. The differences experienced by the Gulfport Police Department and the New Orleans Police Department may be a result of the differences in situational conditions. By situational conditions, I'm referring to the degree of chaos experienced, the nature of the impact of the disaster, as well as the other situational factors in regards to the availability of patrol cars, the availability of strong leadership and the like, as well as the size of the department and the culture of the department. And so while there were no reported incidents of abandonment of duty within the Gulfport Police Department, I wanted to really reflect on some of the quotes that were mentioned during as I was discussing the responses from some of the police officers when asked if you experienced role conflict. So while some of them said no, and while some of them, there was no reporting of abandonment of duty, some of the officers mentioned that they took time off from their assigned duties to actually go and check on their family. And so within the context of what is considered to be role abandonment, if you go back to the original definitions of it, there were some officers within this department that actually did take time off to take care of their families, but it wasn't conceptualized as role abandonment by superiors. Either that or it wasn't brought to the attention of the superiors. And so the degree to which it became an issue, was an issue within these police departments, differed greatly. And so part of what I want to argue is that context matters. That while some officers may leave posts temporarily without notice to take care of personal responsibilities, it's important to ask, is that role abandonment? Is that post abandonment? And so again, I'm arguing that the context really, really matters. I want to highlight a few other things here. I would say, generally speaking, that Even though previous research indicates that role conflict is not a problem among first responders, it may be contingent upon the nature of the disaster incidents in which the data are based, as the types of reporting, as well as the types of reporting agents used in the various studies. So if we go back and we think about some of the earlier literature that I mentioned, Dines interviewed organization officials who may be less inclined to disclose role abandonment among their employees. In other words, if your key informants are officials who are officially representing a department, they may be less inclined to admit that there was some degree of role abandonment. Additionally, I think it's also important to consider that a disaster, not all disasters are equal. And so the nature of one disaster might be so that it does not pose a personal, might not personally impact the first responders the way another disaster would. And I believe that if you're personally impacted by a disaster, you might be more inclined to experience some degree of role conflict. And clearly, in the data that I presented there, the officers, both in New Orleans as well as the officers in Gulfport, experienced some degree of conflict. So, again, I want to restate that the study's findings highlight the existence of role conflict among some of the first responders who were personally impacted by the Katrina disaster. And while role abandonment has not been a critical issue in most of the critical incidents we have experienced as a nation, the findings in the study suggest that role conflict is a potential issue among first responders when they are faced with choosing between their professional and personal responsibilities, particularly when they have concerns about the safety of their loved ones in the midst of a disaster. One social identity appears to play a major part in the ranking of priorities during a disaster, as some of the interviewed officers articulated clearly that they put their family first, while others clearly placed the role that they play as officers above their family. As one officer stated, my job was first before, during, and after Katrina. Clearly, this person sees himself as an officer first, and family comes second. And so, again, I want to articulate that I think the potential conflict between professional and personal responsibilities that first responders may face in responding to an incident can represent a distinctive feature of a catastrophic event. And therefore, I think it's really important to pay attention to the dilemmas and challenges faced by the first responder community. So thank you for your, hopefully you've been paying attention. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to address any questions you might have.
Thank you so much for that informative talk. And I know that there are questions. Actually, I know that there is one already that the student unfortunately had to leave a few minutes early, but he shared the question with us. And I'm going to let our other faculty member who's online to read that to you and share that with you. And I have a few students that are already saying thank you on the online chat. So
great.
I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hayogans, and he's going to share the student's comments and question with you.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. Thank you. Actually, I read it. It's a statement from Robert Bailey, then a question, but maybe it's something that you can speak to. Sure. Robert said, and he apologized, he had to go to work. He said, I am a Pennsylvania State Trooper, and I can speak on the organizational culture of law enforcement. Law enforcement is no different from any other field. It is a subculture of the workplace. From my experience, law enforcement officers do have a similar mindset, which is typically an A-type personality. Those that do not conform to the norm of the culture will be ostracized or considered not trustworthy because they deviate from the norm. This is no different from society norms where a pedophile who truly believes there's nothing wrong with having sexual relationships with a child that's underage. This is not acceptable because of society norms. As far as role conflict is concerned, yes, it can play a role in the way decisions are made. As first responders, and I apologize for the length of this, but I'm reading what he wrote.
Okay.
As first responders, it is our job to be the incident commander of the scene until relieved of duties. I have witnessed role abandonment more than I would like to in my experience. Unfortunately, some law enforcement officers do not follow regulations. Some have the mentality, I am here to collect a paycheck. Can this issue be resolved? I do not think so. Unfortunately, in this current economy, the type of people who enter law enforcement are those looking for job stability rather than actually fulfilling the job requirement. And I'm not sure if you found that in your study or not, if you could speak to what Robert's talking about.
Yes, and I'd like to thank him for his comment, actually. I think it's interesting that he said that he has experienced role abandonment, I guess, among his fellow officers more than he, I can't remember exact wording that or how he phrased it, but more than he would like to say. And so I think it's important that we be honest about the existence of role abandonment so we can better address this issue. I think what he's getting to here is the fact that some people get acculturated into the police culture, and while others don't, and possibly a part of the acculturation process. A part of the acculturation process, I believe I should say, is that you adapt to the ideals, some of the ideals that I mentioned earlier in the talk, and if you don't accept those ideals, if you're just there for a paycheck, then you're not going to take on the role and the responsibility of being a law enforcement officer quite like those who would take on those ideals. And so I think that he brings in or highlights an important point, which is that culture or the lack of acceptance of the culture of a particular profession can cause one to not show up when it's time to show up in regards to performing their role when necessary. And you know, that's not a value judgment that I'm making here. I'm just saying that that police culture is plays a pivotal role in how people perform their jobs. And so I want to thank him for highlighting that.
Hopefully
you. Hopefully I addressed that point.
All right, so we have one more question, or we can take that. There are more. Great. Julia, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was wondering, the family support seemed to come up a lot, and as a military dependent, it's a big deal, so that, in my case, the Marines can go to the fight without sweating so much about what's going on back home. So there are a lot of programs in place, and increasingly so. I don't know, and I guess what I was wondering is, do you know, is that common in police culture to have those kind of support networks set up, or is that sort of a new thing?
I would say that it's sort of a new thing, and in the sites that I've had the privilege of collecting data at, they've all have established some type of protocol or a set of protocols that they have in place in case another crisis happens, where there's a system where they will go and check on each other's family members, and the establishment of a communication network, and so that people will have be able to feel like their families are being taken care of. And I'd also like to say that and I didn't have time to highlight this, but when you compare the two departments that we talked about today, in the Gulfport, it's a much smaller department than the New Orleans Police Department. And so the Gulfport Department, people know each other. They're more like family versus a larger agency where you have about, the department is smaller now, about 1,500 officers. You're not going to have that same type of level of interaction that you're going to have with a smaller department. But with that being said, both departments do have in place now a system, because family support, as you mentioned, is extremely important, and the lack thereof or concern for family seemed to pose a major problem for the officers as they were working.
Thank you.
For your question.
Go ahead, Keith.
That actually kind of answered my question, so I'll just defer. It looks like Dr. H has a question.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was wondering, obviously Katrina changed a lot, and you talk about the family and the role of abandonment. Recently, a year or two ago, when we talked about the pandemic, one of the big issues was, do you vaccinate the responders and the responders' families? And it was decided that we would, because of the fact that if you know somebody's taken care of, then hopefully the responders can do their job better. But my question, aside from that, that was more of a statement. My question is, and I know you're studying police officers and this concept, and you spoke briefly about the other emergency responders. Is this more of an issue with police? Like Juliet talked about the military, we also have, firefighters, we have EMTs. Did your study address that at all, or were you just kind of more focused on the police because, especially in New Orleans, that was a real key with the studies and the news reports?
Right. No, actually, originally just kind of focused on the police, but I do have data that we've collected with the firefighters as well as the EMTs in New Orleans, and but we haven't. I didn't report on that today, but we do have data for the firefighters as well as the EMTs. Again, in New Orleans, we just don't have it for Gulfport.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, go ahead.
You know what? And I wish that I could address the issue of whether or not if they experienced role conflict within these agencies as well. But I haven't fully kind of reviewed or massaged that data quite like I have the other data that I reported on. But I do know that members of these communities also experience some degree of it. To what degree, I can't talk about that right now. I'm sorry, next question? Yes.
Pascal, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I don't know if I misunderstood the first part of the presentation, but I would like to know if you can tell us what are the major factors leading to role conflict and what strategies can be used efficiently to handling role conflict.
Can I ask you? There was a little bit of background noise. Can I ask you to restate the last part of your question?
Yeah, I would like to know what strategy is most efficient in handling role conflict.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And I wish I could have gotten in the discussion about that, but so thank you for your question. I think one of the major ways of dealing with role conflict kind of goes back to one of the earlier questions concerning family support. Because most of the responders who did say that they experienced a degree of role conflict, as well as if, reviewing some of the other data concerning those who actually left or admitted to abandoning posts, they had concerns about their family. And so if you have support systems in place where those issues are no longer a concern, that will eliminate that the fear that people have that the family members are experiencing some problems and they can't be there for them. But being able to maintain a degree of contact, being able to know that there's a system in place to assist your family and that you can go and kind of focus in on the work and task at hand instead of being preoccupied with thoughts of concern. I think if we can have those strategies in place before something happens, then I think there's going to be less of a potential for role conflict.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you again for your time. I wanted to know a number of students have written that it was also a very interesting talk. So
okay, thank you.
Yeah, greatly appreciate your time, and I look forward to being in touch with you for hopefully collaborating at some point.
Okay, sounds good.
And yeah, have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. You too.
All right.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.